Welcome to the Foxtails International podcast, where every week we explore new stories and tell old tales. We help build a community through the ancient art of storytelling. We tell our stories and hope to inspire you to find your voice, to stand up and sing out. Our stories shape our world. Your stories can change the world. I disagree with Shakespeare. We are more than actors on a stage. You are the author of your life story. Share the link with your friends. Support us by joining our Patreon team. And make sure you subscribe so you never miss an episode. Join us every week to fall in love with the world and all of its possibilities. First, General Logan, please tell us about your family and your early life here in Illinois.
My life, much like your life, began long before I was born, in the great hunger of Ireland, when my father, a mere boy, fled the famine, arriving on the shores of this nation in 1785, just after our nation was born in battle and bloodshed. The family moved over the Allegheny Mountains into southern Ohio, which was then the western wilderness, living along the Ohio River. He quickly realized that every autumn, a flotilla of flatboats would wander down the Mississippi River to New Orleans, and the farmers would sell their goods and then walk the Natchez Trace. Well, my father knew that he could buy horses for nickel on the dollar here in Ohio and then load them on a flatboat. And when he got to New Orleans, sell them for dollars on a nickel. He could make $1,000 a journey back when that kind of money amounted to something. He made the journey several times. But one time he was on his way back. He stopped off in Natchez to exercise his horses. And he met a physician who was seeking an apprentice. So my father signed on for the season. My father often said, we must look to education to raise ourselves up. And he gained a great deal of knowledge about the medical arts. He also gained a great deal of debt. So one more time, he went back to Ohio and bought a flatboat full of horses, floated them down the Ohio River, down the Mississippi, and sold them at a great profit, paid off his debt. But he always kept one of his favorite horses. And on his way upriver, he stopped in Cape Girardeau, Missouri, where he met a young widow woman. Her husband had recently passed, but he had been the governor of the Missouri Territory. And so with one simple I do, my father became a member of the landed gentry. With one simple I do, my father acquired hundreds of acres and dozens of slaves. And life went along well enough. He sent letters to all of his relations, inviting them to Cape Girardeau, where he gave them land and invested in whatever business they wanted to start, because he knew if Cape Girardeau grew, so would his profits. And things went along well enough, until cholera came creeping up the river, and it claimed a half a dozen relatives, including his beloved wife. And Cape Girardeau held no promise for him. So he moved across the Mississippi River and up the Big Muddy. He bought a huge tract of land in what was then the wilderness of southern Illinois. He donated land that eventually became the county seat of Murfreesboro, because again, he knew if it was the county seat, the land around would rise in value. And it was there that he met his second wife, my mother. If there were landed gentry in southern Illinois, it was my mother's family. My grandfather served in the House of Representatives in Vandalia. My father's brother-in-law, my uncle, was also a member of the House and a prosecutor. Later became the lieutenant governor. I have followed in his footsteps. My father joined the House of Representatives. It was there that he met Abraham Lincoln, a young lawyer, and they helped to move the state capital from Vandalia to Springfield. I remember when I was a little boy standing at my father's side, watching the state capital rise and vowing someday that I would serve the population of southern Illinois as their representative. But I get ahead of myself. My father often said we must look to education to raise ourselves up. So he provided the best education that one could acquire in the western wilderness. He hired a private tutor to prepare us so my brother Tommy and I could go to Shiloh Academy. And eventually I went to the University of Louisville, where I earned a degree in law, but I get ahead of myself. 2 memories from my early days. One time, I was fishing in the Big Muddy River, and woohoo! I caught a 50-pound catfish. But when I looked around, there was no one who would bask in the glory. So I affixed a firm hook and line, and I released that fish in a neighbor's farm pond. And the next day, when neighbors were about, woohoo! I caught a 50-pound catfish. Understand the neighbors are still fishing in that pond, hoping to catch another one. One night, my brother Tommy and I were coming home after dark. I'd found an old black bottle. It was empty, and I was just flipping and playing with this bottle when my brother Tommy wandered off the trail. A cougar came out of nowhere. I saw it in the nick of time. I jumped in the way, elbowed Tommy, smashed the bottle over the cougar's nose, knocked him to the ground, and with a broken bottle, sliced the cougar's throat, left him bleeding and twitching in the dirt. Tommy and I hightailed it out of there. Now, some say this is a story of my boundless courage. Others say it's my foolhardy nature. I'll let you decide. One last story. I remember one time I was walking along the top. Did I say walking? I was dancing on a neighbor's fence and playing my fiddle. And when my neighbor came out and saw me dancing on the top of a fence, she said, "John A. Logan, you'll amount to nothing. What do you hope to be when you grow up?" And as I was dancing and fiddling there, I said, "I will be a U.S. congressman," which eventually I became. Another question? You speak of Mr. Lincoln, and you mentioned your father's friendship with Abraham Lincoln. Can you tell us about your relationship with President Lincoln? Well, the truth is, Mr. Lincoln and my father were good friends. As already mentioned, he helped to move the state capital. And Lincoln named a county, Logan County. The county seat is Lincoln, Illinois. But Mr. Lincoln and I, when I earned a seat in the House of Representatives, we were on opposite sides of the aisle and opposite sides of many an issue. He was a Whig and I was a Southern Democrat. And when Lincoln and Douglas came to Southern Illinois in their famous debates, I stood on the podium and I introduced Senator Douglas. And when I threw my hat in the ring for Douglas, Douglas won Southern Illinois decidedly. Well, maybe I should also tell you that I frequently won my votes with 80 to 85% of the population. Wouldn't you be happy to win with 50%? And then when the war began, I was reluctant to speak. I did meet with Mr. Lincoln in Washington, and he encouraged me to keep my seat in the federal House of Representatives, that I could be outspoken to help save the Union. I could use my talents as a speaker. I wasn't sure. And then, during the war, Lincoln and Grant ordered that I take a leave of absence to tour the northern states to speak out against the war. I would not speak for Mr. Lincoln's re-election, though he knew it might help if I spoke to save the Union and the Great Union Address. In Des Moines, I eventually gathered 5,000 people. In Chicago, 10,000, a fifth of the city. I guess I performed well enough. They sent me on to Cleveland and Cincinnati and Columbus, Ohio, where 10 or 20,000 people were in attendance. And it's reported that President Lincoln told his secretary, Nicolay or Hay, "John A. Logan's performing well enough, we forgive him for all past sins and all future ones as well."
Please, sir, allow me to be blunt. Were you or were you not a Confederate sympathizer, a Copperhead? Did you organize troops to fight against the United States government?
Are you calling me a Copperhead? A traitor to this nation? A serpent that lives in the swamps of the South? Well, truth be told, my father-in-law and my brother-in-law were arrested as Copperheads. And my brother Tommy spoke out against the war. And when the war began, I was strangely silent. For a man who liked to hear himself speak, I was against the war, but I was for the Union. And then I was invited to Springfield. And it seems that Grant, at that point still a colonel in charge of the 21st Regiment, I believe, his men had enlisted for 90 days. And it was coming up on the 90th day. Because we all believed the war would last less than 3 months. And the soldiers were ready to go home for want of action. Now, Grant invited a friend of his and a friend of mine, McClernand, also a congressman, to speak, to rally the troops. McClernand brought me along. Grant was reluctant to give me the podium. Maybe he had read those northern newspapers accusing me of being a copperhead. He agreed to let me speak. When I took the podium, I began with a joke. I said, boys, I understand that you might be going home on the morrow. And if you do, when you arrive, your wife will say, how far south did you fight? And if you say, Mattoon, what kind of a soldier are you? Then I spent 2 hours telling a dozen stories of the bravery and valor of the volunteer soldier, how they created this union and would save it now. I worked myself up into such a lather, and the men as well, that to a man they re-enlisted. And Grant even said they would follow me to the ends of the earth as long as this nation had an enemy in the field. And that was then that my friendship with Grant began.
Thank you, sir, for putting that rumor to rest. You mentioned General Grant. Can you tell us about your relationship with General Grant and your role during the Civil War?
To tell you about my role in the war would require several hours, and our time is short. But I will tell you, I went back to Southern Illinois, and I rallied the troops, and then marched off to Cairo to train those troops. Going down to Cairo, goodbye, goodbye. Going down to Cairo, goodbye, Liza Jane. Blacken my boots and make them shine, goodbye, goodbye. Blacken my boots and make them shine, goodbye, Liza Jane. At Cairo, we boarded steamboats and we headed down to Belmont. Grant wisely uses steamboats to catch the Confederates unawares. The steamboats hit the shore and we chased them out of town into a cornfield before they reorganized and chased us through the same cornfield and back onto the boats. Grant passed 3 corn rows away from the Confederate officers. If they had captured him in the early days, how the war might have changed. Grant put my boys in charge of holding the line. He said, we cut our way in, we can cut our way out. And we were the wedge to cut through the Confederate troops. Now, when the steamboat captain heard the Confederate artillery coming close, he was ready to pull away. I pulled a pistol and said, sir, if you know what is good for you, you will stay here on the shore until all of my boys are on board. What would you do? Exactly as I wished. Now, both sides want to claim Belmont as a victory. At best, it was a draw. But we headed on down the river. And Grant wisely used the steamboats once more to hammer Fort Henry. Fort Henry was built on the Tennessee River in a floodplain, and the river was high. He rained down 300 cannonballs an hour. The Confederates hightailed it. They crossed the isthmus from the Tennessee to the Cumberland River, and we gave chase. Now, it was an unusually warm February day, so we peeled off our heavy wool coats and dropped many of our blankets and supplies so we could make double time, and we locked them into Fort Donaldson on the Cumberland. You did hear me say it was an unusually warm February day. For the next 3 days, a freezing rain turned to sleet and eventually snow. On the 3rd morning, we woke up literally frozen to the ground. And as we cracked and peeled ourselves free, little did we know that the Confederate General Pillow was planning his escape along the Cumberland River, where my boys were camped. The 31st, though we were outgunned, surrounded, we refused to surrender. We not only held our position, but we pushed the Confederates back into the fort. And the victory was ours. From that day on, the 31st is known as the Dirty First because we never met a battle we backed away from. But in the heat of battle, I took a musket ball in the leg. It was through and through. I was on a horse, so I rode on. Another mini ball hit the butt of my pistol, broke some ribs. But the butt of my pistol saved my life. When the medic wanted to pull me from the field, I said, no. As long as my boys got fight in them, I need to be there to lead them. I caught a third mini ball in the shoulder, through and through, knocked me from my horse. I bled out, froze to the ground in a pool of my own blood. When the medic came through and saw the snow stained crimson red, he took me for dead. Another medic came through, kicking the dead and wounded to see if I was among the living. He hardly found a pulse, but he rescued me. Now imagine my wife's horror when she reads the morning paper. Fort Donaldson falls. Logan gives his life in the battle. Imagine her grief. She jumped on a train and headed to Cairo. She found a steamboat captain who took her deep into the south across enemy lines, and she found me among the living. On Grant's headquarters, it was a steamship called the Uncle Sam. The surgeon was about to remove my arm. He said there was nothing could be done for it. Gangrene, infection would set in. My wife argued vociferously, not only saving this arm, but saving my life. It still pains me, especially when a storm is coming. The shoulder of this old soldier still gives me grief. But my wife took me home, and she saved my life. She nursed me back to health, and I miss Shiloh. I wish I could have been there, for my boys fought bravely, but I miss Shiloh. Until that day, the bloodiest day in American history, 23,000 men and boys gave their lives. There's one pond still called Bloody Pond because it was more blood than water. Then we marched off to Corinth. Now at Corinth, we were under the command of General Halleck. Halleck was known as Old Brains. He was without a doubt one of the smartest, wisest, best schooled officers I ever had the privilege to serve under. But he took so much time weighing his possibilities, surveying every option, that by the time we attacked, the Confederates had hightailed it, and we were firing at scarecrows. They put scarecrows, dummies, in their embattlements. But Corinth was a victory. And then we marched on down to Vicksburg. Vicksburg was a mighty pretty town. Yeah, Vicksburg was a mighty pretty town. To the Union we came and we just burned it down. Yes, Vicksburg was a mighty pretty town. Vicksburg is built on a bluff above the Mississippi where it does a series of hairpin curves. So every steamboat coming downstream is fired down upon, and it's hard to fire back. To the north is the Yazoo River, and to the south an impenetrable swamp. Grant tried many things. Some say he was wasting time, but Grant knew what he was doing. He was testing the defenses. He sent me and my boys along the Louisiana shore, where one of them steamboats ran the gauntlet and ferried us across. We were greeted by 5,000 Confederates when we hit the shore at Port Gibson. They had the superior position on a hill, but I sent my 31st to lead the charge, and we pushed them off the hill, and Port Gibson was ours. We headed towards Jackson, the capital of Mississippi, and our next encounter was at Raymond, another quick victory. At Jackson, we were able to divide the Confederate forces and push Pemberton into Vicksburg. The real battle for Vicksburg was in the weeks leading up to it, and the most critical battle was Champion's Hill, where once more my boys outflanked the Confederacy, pushed them off the hill, and the day was ours. I should have been proud, and I was, but we let Pemberton get away. We lay in siege at Vicksburg for nearly 60 days. We starved them out. And we learned something important, that we did not need long supply chains, that we could not fortify and be easy for the Confederates to cut. We learned to live off the land, to forage, to feed the men. Excuse me, ma'am, may I borrow that chicken of yours? It's not roosting too comfortably. And how about that cow? You don't need all that milk, do you? Here's an IOU. Uncle Sam will repay you, of course. The Confederates weren't too happy about feeding the enemy soldiers. But we grew fat on the land while we starved them out quite literally. Now, I did use my boys. There was a Stolbrand, it was the Swedish brigade. Now, those Swedish boys, many of them from Bishop Hill, Illinois, they fought bravery in every battle in the western frontier. Stolbrand was my artilleryman. He was from Chicago. He knew how far a cannonball would fly. So I set up my officer's tent just out of range. Grant loved to come to my tent, for it was the best place to survey the enemy. We also dug a tunnel under the Confederate embattlements, packed it with gunpowder, blew them sky high. But when we sent our men to tunnel in, the sides of the crater were too steep. And the Confederates, it was like shooting fish in a barrel. And within a few minutes, I lost hundreds of my bravest soldiers and called them back. There was one silver lining in that dark cloud. There was a young Negro blown sky high to freedom. Whoom! He landed right outside my tent, picked himself up, brushed himself off, stepped across the line, and he was a free man. You have to agree, it was the most unusual path to freedom. We named him Abraham for the author of the Emancipation Proclamation. Actually, I sent a letter to my friend P.T. Barnum, and he worked the sideshows. The most unusual path to freedom. Finally, Vicksburg surrendered. Do you know the day? Do you know your American history? Clearly, the Confederates at Vicksburg did not. They surrendered on the 4th of July, Independence Day. Newspapers splashed the headline across the country. Vicksburg liberated on Independence Day. Or the victory at Vicksburg and Gettysburg. It turned the tide, boosted morale. Why, even the president of the Confederacy said, Vicksburg is the tack that holds the two halves of the South together. And Abraham Lincoln said, the one who captures Vicksburg shall win the war. Cut off Hogs and Hominy from the west. The Mississippi flowed unvexed onto the sea. And I had a terribly frustrating summer, chasing Confederate guerrillas all over the South. Till finally, I joined with Sherman in his march towards Atlanta. Again, like Vicksburg, the battle for Atlanta was in the days and weeks leading up to the battle. Sherman and the Confederate officers fell into this terrible dance. The Confederates, because it was their home territory, they would claim a mountain. They would dig in and build entrenchments and battlements, and we would try to take that mountain. Well, Sherman would send my boys, would swing around and would outflank them, push them off the mountain, and they would fall back. We'd swing around and push them off the mountain, and they would fall back. And so it went for weeks. When we got to Resaca, we were at the top of the mountain, and we looked down and we saw the town was nearly vacant. If we could capture the rail line at Resaca, we could cut off their retreat. My commander said, no. We have 3 regiments. I could do it with my boys from the 15th. And he said, no. I argued with my commanding officer. Yes, sir, I did as I was told. I held my position. And we watched as thousands, tens of thousands of Confederates poured into town. We could have taken it and stopped this little dance. And we quickly realized the hill from which we viewed the town was where they practiced their artillery fire. And they began exploding cannons all around us. The other officers, they fled, but me and my boys, we enjoyed a little fireworks before we left at our leisure. At Kennesaw Mountain, there are actually 3 mountains, all one ridge line. And because they were entrenched on all 3, we could not outflank them so easily. So we sent a feint, and Sherman sent my boys as a head-on attack. The worst losses were at Kennesaw. Nearly 3,000 men in one day of fighting from my unit alone. So we swung wide and we drew them off the mountain. And the Confederates had a new officer, Johnson, who wanted to fight, and we gave him a fight. And our final push towards Atlanta, he came out with 60,000 men to meet us head on. Just as my flank was beginning to fall and other Union troops were in retreat, our leading officer on the field took a bullet and fell from his horse. At this critical juncture, we were rudderless, leaderless, until I realized that these 2 stars made me the highest ranking officer on the field that day. So I jumped onto my black stallion. I was not a man to lead from an officer's tent. I led from the front, and I whipped my horse, and I whipped the men, not retreat, to give it their all. to die a hero rather than flee a coward. And a shout came up. Rally round the flag, boys, rally once again, shouting the battle cry of freedom. Could you imagine 10,000 voices? Why, one officer even said that I by myself was with an entire platoon. I not only plugged the hole, but I pushed the Confederates back, and the day was ours. And the very next day, Sherman demotes me. The position that I had claimed on the battlefield that was rightfully mine, he takes and he gives it to one of his West Point friends. Sherman always showed preferential treatment to his West Point professional soldiers. No love for us volunteers. But had we not fought as bravely? Weren't most of these men volunteers, risking their lives to save the Union? For the first time, I waffled. I thought I could go home. Lord knows I miss my wife and my children. But Grant and Lincoln had higher plans. They called me back to Washington. They wanted me to take Nashville. If I arrived and Nashville had not been won, then the command was mine. But while I was on the train, Nashville fell. I'm not sad to say I miss Sherman's march to the sea. He left a 100-mile-wide swath of destruction. Some say the scars have not yet healed. Sherman is often quoted as saying, "War is hell." I say it's the hell you make of it. But I did rejoin my troops at Savannah, as Sherman gave Savannah to Lincoln as a Christmas present. And we ranged our way up through South Carolina. We captured the capital of South Carolina and headed towards Raleigh. When we entered North Carolina, we knew the war was nearly over, and the officers decided to have a little ceremony to raise a toast, and I played a tune on my fiddle, and we danced. We went more than 20 days without any real opposition before we got word that Lee and Grant had met at Appomattox and the war was over. And the next day, we got word that Lincoln had been assassinated. This man that I knew since I was a small boy, and though we were on opposite sides of a political fight, I grew to admire him. He was dead. Lincoln had saved the Union. The war was over. And he was dead. I wept. And my boys, they wanted revenge. They wanted to burn Raleigh, North Carolina. I said, over my dead body. The war is over. If you burn Raleigh, it's the women and children who will suffer most. They marched on. I rode my horse in front of them and turned the artillery. So if they continued their march, they would be facing Union fire. They ceased and desist, and Raleigh was saved. It was in May, the first day of the grand parade, with the boys from the Eastern troops in their finely tailored suits and their polished brass buttons. But May 24th, I finally received my due. Sherman and Grant agreed to let me lead the Army of the Tennessee. No, it wasn't me. It was my black stallion, Slasher. Never have I felt more proud to be a member of this Union Army, to lead the column of boys from Illinois, Iowa, Michigan, and Wisconsin who had fought so valiantly throughout the war. And after the war, I returned to my seat in the House of Representatives. I'm a little embarrassed to ask, but before the war, you were known as a racist among racists who wrote the black laws, making it illegal to be a free black man here in Illinois. But now, after the war, you are an advocate for Negro civil rights. What changed? You should be embarrassed to ask that question. Now, I have my prejudices like every man. You must understand, I was born in Southern Illinois, which is the South. Need I remind you that Cairo is further south than the capital of the Confederacy, Richmond, Virginia? My father did own slaves, and I represented the values of Southern Illinois. So yes, I did write the black laws, codifying what was already the law of the land. I may have written the black laws, but a majority of the House of Representatives, a majority of the state Senate, and our governor signed that bill into legislation. My father was kinder to his slaves than most. He said that no family should be separated. But when I saw the sin of slavery in the South, it began to change my mind. And when Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, I saw it as a necessary act in a time of war, for it made no sense for slaves to be building embattlements to protect their masters who would keep them in bondage. And that changed my mind as a military act. But what changed my heart was a young woman named Zila. She was mulatto. Her father was her master, who took advantage of his slaves in the most unspeakable manner, as was common in the South, treating his slaves as his personal concubine. But then he sold his daughter to a master he knew would treat his own flesh and blood. He sold his daughter to slavery. When we were raging over Tennessee, she was able to escape. And she got a job working for the Union as a laundress. When her master heard that he had lost his property, he tried several ways to get her back until finally he secrets a letter saying, "He's sick and dying. One more time, please." I told her it was a lie, it was a ruse, but she would not listen to me because she had already listened to me when I told her she was a free woman and could make up her own mind. She found her way across enemy lines, and her master sold her down to Holly Springs, Mississippi. And what became of her, one can only imagine. That she returned to the same abuse. It broke my heart. It changed my heart. And I vowed then I would not sheath my sword until I had wiped this abomination from the earth. No. It broke my heart. It changed my heart. And I vowed then to do everything within my power to end this abomination. And my power is great. I will not sheathe my sword until I have wiped slavery from the land. That's what changed my heart. And of course, after the war, I became an advocate for Negro rights. I would much rather have a colored man sitting in the legislature beside me than a Southern Democrat who had been a traitor. The colored man had earned the right to vote. He had saved the Union. And it would not be amiss to have a person of color in the White House. For as my father said, our government allows us to rise by merit and fall by demerit. And it is not impossible for a man born in the humblest log cabin to claim the White House as his home, as we well know. It was even said in my recent run for the vice presidency that Frederick Douglass said that if I would have been at the top of the ticket, the Negro vote would have turned out and the White House might be mine. I had difficulty reclaiming my seat in the Senate. But when my wife and I returned to Washington, we were greeted by 5,000 former slaves who sang to us, "Swing low, sweet chariot, coming for to carry me home. Swing low, sweet chariot, coming for to carry me home." Could you imagine 5,000 voices singing late into the night? I invited them to come into my home. And I took their hand and I thanked each and every one of them. Spent a long night in gratitude for their service, for they saved this Union. They won this war. What was your role in creating Memorial Day? Well, quite honestly, I cannot say that I created Memorial Day. It became a tradition for people to take flowers and lay them on the grave of the dying soldiers. And when my wife toured the South, she saw this tradition, and when she came home, she said, "John A. Logan, you should do something about this." Well, when my wife, who wrote for Cosmopolitan magazine, says, "John A. Logan, you should do something about this," I did something about this. And I issued Order 11, ordering the members of the Grand Army of the Republic to decorate the graves of the fallen with flowers. And then in the Senate, I pushed through the legislation to create Decoration Day, now called Memorial Day. And let me end on this note. Please, on the upcoming day of Memorial Day, in the midst of your barbecues and family picnics, take a moment, even if it's just a moment in silent prayer, to give thanks to the men who gave their lives to save this nation. Thank you for listening, and I hope I have your vote in the next election.
Thank you for joining us for another episode of Foxtails International Podcast. Follow this link to invite me to your community, or take a look at my schedule to see when I might be performing near you. Share the link with your friends, support us by joining our Patreon team, and make sure you subscribe so you never miss an episode. Join us every week to fall in love with the world and all of its possibilities.